heard over the crunching of cookies and the gnashing of lettuce. It's a pleasure to see everybody here. It's a little bit of a fun, hybrid opportunity, silk purse out of sow's ear kind of moment. I have with me on my right Kay Wells, who has been a research fellow here at the Bard Graduate Center from third week in May, second week in May? June 1st until tomorrow. And over that time, she has been in residence while most of the Bard Graduate Center has been elsewhere. So she's had the experience of working and walking through an empty intellectual house. And it's just a wonderful bit of luck that she's still here when all of you have just arrived, or in terms of my colleagues, come back. And so we thought we would take advantage of this opportunity that presented itself to not only do what we always do with our research fellows, and that is learn from them in the context in which we prefer our learning to happen, that's to say, around a table, and ideally with food, and more ideally with wine as well, but not at lunchtime. For those of you who are new to the institution, we have a very active program of seminars that occur in the evening on Tuesday and Wednesday nights, but also in the 12 to 1:30 slot, Monday to Friday as well, sometimes on the same day. So this is, for our incoming students, a pretty representative example of what the lunchtime can look like, packed to the gills with people looking for sustenance at lunchtime.
Intellectual sustenance.
Goes without saying. I have to say also that I have been thinking at times about Kay over the summer, especially when reading the sad articles that appeared from time to time in June and the first part of July in the New York Times about the closure of the Four Seasons restaurant, which, for those of you who know about it or have been there, the entrance to the pool room at the restaurant was graced by Picasso's tricorn, which was a textile that he produced as backdrop for a Diaghilev ballet of 1919, which was ripped out by, or was about to be ripped out by the current owner of the building, and has been preserved and is on view now at the New York Historical Society just down the street. But that's really, in a sense, what Kay works on, tapestry in the 20th century, in particular on the arrival of French modern and modernist tapestry in the United States and in New York. She first came to the Bard Graduate Center in a roundabout way, since her PhD was being done at the time at the University of Southern California, which is in Los Angeles, but she first came to UGC while she was a pre-doctoral fellow at the University of Zurich as part of a large textile grant run by Professor Tristan Vettigan. And at some point, as in the nature of large grants, which come to an end, there was a little money left over. And so Tristan came to the United States with a group of his colleagues, postdocs and pre-docs, and they gave a presentation here as part of our own textile initiative a couple of years ago. And so we first had a chance to hear Kay's work. In the meantime, of course, she's finished her PhD in 2014, and she's published a few articles. Just to give you a sample of the titles: The Merely Imitative Mood, British Japonism and Imperial Mimesis, which was forthcoming in 19th century studies; Rockefeller's Guernica and the Collection of Modern Copies, which appeared in the Journal of the History of Collections in 2014; Serpentine Sideboards, Hogarth's Analysis and the Beautiful Self, which was published in 18th Century Studies in the spring of 2013. In her talk this afternoon, she will tell us something about how the revival of French tapestry as a medium for modern art furthered the promotion of modernism in both France and the United States. It's my pleasure to turn over the floor to Kate.
Well, thank you all so much for coming. Can people hear me, or do I need to speak more into the mic? So first, a blatant plug for a panel I'm organizing at CAA. That's what maybe some of you are reading up on the screen. The panel is called Modernism's Craft Discourse. It comes out of the work that I'll be presenting today. And the deadline to submit a paper is not until next week. So if anyone is interested in appearing in the panel, please feel free to submit. Otherwise, I hope to see you there. CAA is, of course, in New York this year, so none of you have an excuse for missing it. So the title of my book is Weaving Modernism, Postwar Tapestry Between Paris and New York. Although I should note that if anyone has a suggestion for a better title, I'm all ears. And I thought for my talk today that I would just read you the introduction to the book. This is a newer piece of writing that I've been working on this summer. And I've really been making revisions to the entire manuscript this summer, so it was hard to kind of, pick out the one part that was in progress, because the whole thing has been a work in progress. So I'll read the introduction, and then as I go through the chapter outlines, I'll show you more of the images from the other chapters, and if there's anything people want to hear more about, we can talk about that in the Q&A. Okay, so imagine a tapestry by an artist whose last name is Albers that exemplifies geometric abstraction. A series of rectilinear forms in shades of red, violet, and teal seem to push forward and pull back. Their clear outlines echo the shape of the tapestry and the grid of its weave, emphasizing its vertical warp and horizontal weft. The materiality of the tapestry's threads gives these blocks of color a visible heft, a sense of substance and weightiness, even as the colors seem to float and radiate in space. From this description, most readers would assume I am referring to a work by Annie Albers, the famous Bauhaus weaver and designer who hand-wove prototypes for the textile industry and, increasingly after World War II, for works of art. Having fled Nazi Germany for the United States, she trained a new generation of artists in innovative weaving techniques and is easily considered the most influential artist-weaver of the 20th century. The story of her weavings, though certainly not exhausted, is relatively well known. But the tapestry I described above is not by Annie Albers, but by her husband, Joseph. Joseph Albers made this tapestry, not by weaving it, but by creating a design that his Parisian dealer, Denise René, had executed at the Atelier Tabard, a prestigious weaving workshop in Aubusson, France, in 1967. Like most of the other tapestry artists that this book considers, Joseph Albers enjoyed a certain prestige as a man, a painter, and an established artist at the height of his career. Indeed, his enlistment into tapestry design in 1965 was evidence that there was already a ready market for his work. Because tapestry weaving is a labor-intensive and expensive undertaking, most producers focused on soliciting designs by well-known artists that would sell more reliably. Denise René, the producer of tapestries by Albers and other geometric abstract painters represented by her gallery, was no exception, and Albers began designing tapestries at her urging. He is also typical of the tapestry artists considered in this book in that his endeavor was transatlantic. Although working in the US, his tapestries were made, and in this case sold, in France. These works united the prestige of a French luxury craft tradition with a style of late modernist painting that had become deeply associated with the power of the post-war United States. Joseph's tapestry output pales in comparison to that of his wife, but the assumption that a tapestry would be by Annie rather than Joseph Albers still illustrates the somewhat one-sided picture that scholars have painted of modernism's relationship to textiles. The literature today creates a collective impression that modern artist textiles function primarily as innovative applied arts in the form of clothing, rugs, furnishing fabrics, embroideries, and needlepoints, that its most important practitioners were women, and that such practices were part of the historical avant-garde's utopian efforts to unify art and life. Yet examining the phenomenon of tapestry after World War II paints a very different picture of modernism's relationship with textiles. Postwar Tapestry shows that textiles could also be collected as standalone art objects, that they could be designed by established artists, mostly men, and that while they did help extend art into daily life, they did so mainly by increasing the visibility of modern art in conservative sites like art museums, houses of worship, and corporate headquarters. So just how visible was modern tapestry in the post-war period? Denise Majorelle, one of the foremost dealers of modern tapestries in Paris, estimated that in the 40 years following World War II, there were over 3,000 exhibitions of modern tapestries organized internationally. In the US, modern tapestries were exhibited at such venues as the Sidney Janis Gallery and the Art Institute of Chicago, organized by such institutions as the Smithsonian and the Museum of Modern Art in New York, collected by such figures as Nelson Rockefeller and Gordon Bunshaft, and designed by a wide range of artists, from Robert Motherwell to Roy Lichtenstein. This book considers tapestries by some 30 artists working in France and the United States, but it is by no means a complete survey. And I will just note for people who might be starting dissertations in this room, I do not recommend trying to write your dissertation about 30 different artists. It makes writing the book a lot harder. So this book is designed to complement rather than supplant documentary accounts of specific post-war tapestry projects that have been offered elsewhere. And the specialized tapestry literature has tended to narrate the history of tapestry as separate from the history of modernism. My aim, however, is to interrogate the relationship between the two. Why would so many modern artists be drawn to tapestry after World War II, and what impact did tapestry have on modernism in this period? Although initially hailed as avant-garde, the post-war modernist movements of abstract expressionism and color field painting have long been seen as conservative forces that help promote American capitalist democracy abroad and shore up fragile masculinity at home. Examining the role of tapestry in this period does not challenge the establishment nature of post-war modernism. Indeed, this book argues that tapestry enabled the rise of mainstream modernism to its position of dominance, most obviously by expanding the market for modern art, but also in subtler ways in which tapestry served as a conceptual and formal model for modern artists. However, to argue that tapestry helped modernism gain ground in the post-war period is also to argue that this post-war modernism was far from a monolithic entity. This book tackles four main characteristics associated with post-war art that are challenged by modernists' engagement with tapestry: medium specificity, American exceptionalism, originality, and autonomy from decoration. It shows that tapestry enabled the rise of modernism specifically because modernists did not universally reject French art, reproduction, or decoration, but rather embraced these elements of modernism in order to expand the visibility and significance of modern art. The rest of this introduction will consider the two main terms of my investigation, tapestry and modernism, before outlining the chapters that follow. So, defining tapestry. Temporarily putting tapestry at the center of modern art raises a unique set of questions about the history of modernism that are obscured when we attend to more canonical objects. One should note, however, that tapestry is only one such non-canonical object that can help tell a different story of post-war modernism. For modern artists of this period, as many of you know, also made ceramics, mosaics, stained glass, and art books, among other now largely forgotten projects. But each of these arts has its own specific history, and the history of tapestry as a prestigious, public, monumental, and pictorial art gave tapestry a unique relationship to modernist painting. Thus, what is significant about tapestry's role in the 20th century is that it challenges understandings of both modernism and the decorative arts. The French tapestry tradition with which post-war modernists engaged was not a domestic craft practiced by women in the home, but rather a professional industry practiced by skilled workers in specialized workshops. However, its 20th century history is largely separate from that of the rise of industrial design or the emergence of studio craft. European royalty and nobility had patronized tapestry since the Middle Ages, but it was not until the 16th and 17th centuries that princes began to establish their own tapestry workshops and to direct their court painters to provide them with tapestry designs. Louis XIV, you see pictured here on the left in red, established the longest surviving of these royal tapestry workshops, the still extant Manufacture de Gobelin and Manufacture de Beauvais, which produced tapestries after paintings by such artists as Charles Lebrun, whose work you see here. He was the first director of the Gobelin from 1663 to 1690, François Boucher, and Jacques-Louis David, among others. So in addition to reproducing academic paintings, tapestry workshops produce suites or series of tapestries to coordinate with the decorative schemes of royal palaces and aristocratic houses, placing tapestry within a decorative tradition. And you can see here that this image is showing all the products of the Gobelin, not just tapestry, but furniture, marquetry, inlay, and so on. But tapestry is the one that can represent all these other arts. Tapestry is clearly considered superior in that respect. During the 19th and early 20th century, the Manufacture de Beauvais specialized in tapestry panels used to upholster furniture, further linking tapestry with interior decor. Although today the Manufacture de Beauvais is devoted to weaving low-warp tapestries by contemporary artists, it and France's other state-run weaving workshops, the Gobelin and the Manufacture de la Savonnerie, which specializes in pile rugs, are grouped under the Mobilier National, a state agency that furnishes official buildings in France and maintains the national collection of tapestries and historic furniture. In France, then, the country with Europe's most famous and long-standing tapestry workshops, tapestry has been a traditional academic art supported by state patronage that reproduced the paintings of celebrated artists and decorated official buildings. Thus, for the diverse modernists who designed, commissioned, and debated tapestry, to engage with this medium was to engage with issues of historicism, art reproduction, and interior decor. Women's limited participation in the French tapestry industry reflects its relative prestige, and you will note that there are no women in this industry. In the late 19th century, privately held workshops in the weaving towns of Aubusson and Felletin hired women to hand-weave pile rugs, expanding their labor pool to help feed a growing market for this less eminent commodity. And at the same time, the Manufacture Nationale began employing women in specialized tapestry conservation workshops, which utilized sewing as much as weaving. However, it was not until the economic crisis of the 1930s and the Second World War that women in France began to weave tapestries side by side with men. As the market for modern tapestry expanded during the post-war period, many of the new recruits to tapestry weaving were women. But this shift contested, rather than reinforced, traditional notions of women's art in France. In the past, French women who made tapestries at home were actually embroidering tapestry au point, or needlepoints, rather than the much larger woven tapestries that required enormous looms. The French women who turned to tapestry weaving in the middle decades of the 20th century were thus inserting themselves into a relatively elite, male-dominated profession of skilled labor that had traditionally been passed from father to son for generations. Although the workforce weaving tapestries was changing, the labor they performed was largely unaltered. Tapestries are technically defined as discontinuous, weft-faced, plain weave textiles that are hand-woven on high warp, which is to say vertical or low warp horizontal looms. This means that the tapestry weaver does not shuttle the movable threads, the weft, across the entire width of the work, but only interweaves them in discrete areas to create a discontinuous, non-repeating pattern. So obviously you can see in this tapestry that no part of the tapestry is like any other part. And this is an important distinction from other kinds of textile weaving that can be automated because the weft threads extend across the entire expanse of the work, as for example in Mrsa tapestry. A tapestry is weft-faced because only the dyed horizontal threads appear on the surface of the work. None of the undyed vertical threads, known as the warp, show through. Moreover, a tapestry has historically had a flat, plain weave, a relatively smooth surface, in comparison to the plush, fuzzy textures of pile-woven carpets. And of course, plain weave is a technical term referring to that simple over and under patterning that's used in tapestry weaving, but also weaving other kinds of textiles. So the tapestry technique allows for unlimited compositional freedom, and is thus suited to large pictorial scenes like this one, which has aided the long history of comparisons between tapestry and painting. Yet the pictorial qualities of tapestry have also encouraged a more liberal understanding of the term to denote any textile hung on the wall like a picture. The definition of tapestry became particularly imprecise in the post-war period, as artists and critics began describing pile rugs, patchwork quilts, fiber art sculptures, and even paintings as tapestries. However, these expansive interpretations of tapestry still drew upon historical understandings of the medium to connote the prestige, monumentality, and lineage of tapestry as a distinctive artistic practice. So in the post-war period, even when people are calling kind of these non-tapestry things tapestry, they're still sort of have an idea of something like this in mind, right, as some kind of history of tapestry that they're kind of conjuring when they call these modern works tapestries. Many of the tapestries considered in the following pages were actually hand-woven pile rugs, like these. These are made by the Modern Master Tapestries Incorporated, after works by Pierre Mondrian. So pile carpets in which the threads are looped and sometimes sheared to create a plush, fuzzy texture. These pile woven works were produced in collaboration with modern artists by many of the same dealers who produced traditional plain weave tapestries, and they were exhibited and collected as tapestries in the post-war period. Thus, what defined tapestry and separated it from other kinds of hand and machine woven textiles was less its specific technique than its status as a handcrafted pictorial work that could complement the paintings of the artists who designed it. Indeed, perhaps the most salient distinction between tapestry and the other kinds of textiles that figure in histories of modern art is the division of labor between artists and weavers. To date, art historians have largely focused on artists who made their own textile works, whether as part of the applied art experiments of the early 20th century or the fiber art sculptures of the late 20th century. For example, substantial scholarship exists on the Bauhaus weavers and innovative textile artists like Sophie Teuber-Arp and Sonia Delaunay, while a growing literature considers the range of ways that artists began using textiles to create sculptures and installations beginning in the 1960s. However, the mid-century practice of commissioning artists to design tapestries woven by other people has received much less attention, perhaps because such works fit so awkwardly into conventional narratives of post-war modernism as the climax of spontaneous artistic creation and original genius. By attending to other weaving practices at the expense of French tapestry, scholars of modernism have unwittingly reinforced the notion that artists are defined as those who physically make, in this case weave, works of art. But this is a notion that mid-century modernists frequently qualified through their tapestry practices. The French tapestry tradition thus offers a useful counterpoint to existing histories of modernism and the applied arts that draws our attention to the distributed authorship, state sponsorship, and masculine prestige of French luxury crafts. On the other hand, those who have examined the relationship between this French tapestry tradition and the broader field of modernism have focused exclusively on France and have therefore missed the impact of modern tapestry in America. Given New York's centrality to histories of post-war modernism, it is important to understand the visibility that modern French tapestry enjoyed there and what impact this had on how American modernism developed. So, defining modernism, which I should maybe just admit now, I don't actually do. This section is more about defining why I think tapestry should be in modernism. So this book contributes to a growing literature that reconsiders modernism by exploring its relationship to decoration. And this is literature that you guys will all be familiar with, but scholars such as Jennifer Shaw, Jenny Anger, Alistair Wright, and Catherine Kunsley have investigated how male painters such as Pierre Puvis de Chavannes, Paul Klee, Henri Matisse, and the Namie artists drew upon decoration to engage in more avant-garde work, while scholars such as Christopher Reed and Viviana Obler have focused instead on how male and female artists work together in both the fine and applied arts in the Bloomsbury group, German Expressionism, and Swiss Dada. That all of these studies focus on the fin de siècle and early 20th century reflects a general art historical consensus that while early modernism may have engaged with decoration, post-war modernism was too rigidly doctrinal to do the same. Mark Rothko's refusal to have his murals placed in the Four Seasons restaurant at the Seagram building, which you mentioned, and that building was actually home to several modern tapestries, not just the Picasso curtain, but works by Leger and Miro as well. But nonetheless, Rothko's refusal to have his murals placed there is seen as, kind of a paradigmatic example of the way that post-war modernists refused to do decorative work. So the chapters that follow explore many instances of similar tensions when artists and collectors became uneasy with the commercial context of modern tapestry. And since we have Modrian on the screen, I will point out that shortly before he died, he said in an interview that he was often asked to do tapestries, but he always refused because he didn't want to do applied art. And so these tapestries, like a lot of the ones I discuss in my book, were done posthumously by authorized by his heir. And yet, despite Modrian's reluctance, I argue that this idea that as a decorative art, tapestry would have represented a clear threat to modernism is not borne out by the historical evidence. After all, the tapestries were made anyway. And again, tapestry is not necessarily representative of the decorative arts as a whole. Its privileged position within post-war modernism as a generally acceptable practice stems, I would argue, from its dual status as both elite and marginal. On the one hand, tapestry was a prestigious medium, and an invitation to design tapestries was a clear sign of an artist's success. As Le Corbusier wrote to his mother when he was first invited to make a tapestry design, quote, "I'm entering the company of Picasso, Leger, Braque, Matisse, Rouault. I am delighted." On the other hand, tapestry was a safely secondary pursuit for these painters and for most of the other artists considered in this book. Although painting and tapestry shared the same imagery, exhibition spaces, and collectors, tapestries were never valued as highly as paintings in the modern art market, nor were tapestries produced or collected in the same numbers as paintings. Even artists who made extensive series of tapestries, such as Pablo Picasso or Kenneth Nolan, were never at risk of being understood primarily as tapestry artists. Acknowledging this hierarchical relationship between painting and tapestry is an important precursor to what follows. This book therefore echoes much of the recent scholarship on modernism and craft. and that it is less interested in trying to reverse the hierarchy between painting and tapestry than in trying to understand the dialectical relationship between the two. Yet this book also endeavors to show that the hierarchy between painting and tapestry, though present, was never entirely fixed, and that there were moments of reversal when tapestry seemed to have certain advantages over painting, even moments when tapestry seemed to serve as a model for how modernist paintings might be produced and displayed. Although tapestry remained a secondary practice within post-war modernism, examining it still transforms our overall picture of 20th century art. One can understand the importance of considering modern tapestry through the historiographical precedent of Cubism. So just bear with me here. Cubism, of course, is a movement whose division into two wings, gallery cubism versus salon cubism, has had important consequences for our understanding of modern art. Critics from Daniel Henry Kahnweiler and Alfred Barr to Rosalind Krauss and Yves Lambois have understood the gallery cubism of Picasso and Georges Braque, so-called because these artists exhibited exclusively at private commercial galleries, as a cornerstone of modernist innovation through its systematic interrogation of conventional pictorial signs. So this semiotic interpretation of Cubism is really all about gallery cubists. Meanwhile, salon cubists, so-called because they exhibited at the public salon exhibitions, were largely ignored until new scholarship undertaken by Daniel Robbins, Christopher Green, Mark Antliff, David Joslet, and Nancy Troy, my own dissertation advisor, until these scholars brought salon cubists to wider attention. Collectively, this scholarship demonstrated that salon cubists were both more widely known in their own day and had very different concerns from the gallery cubists. The cubism they presented to the public was one invested in perception, movement, color, simultaneity, and even interior design. While one could argue that the salon cubists were ultimately less influential then, and therefore secondary to, the gallery cubists, knowledge of salon cubism is still crucial for understanding the context, public reception, plurality, and contradictions of cubism as it was actually experienced during its historical moment. Examining modern tapestry performs a similar service for our understanding of 20th century art, because tapestry points us to a kind of what I'm calling marketplace modernism, a wider definition of modernism that illuminates its context, public reception, plurality, and contradictions. This marketplace modernism existed in blockbuster exhibitions, biennials, corporate headquarters, government buildings, churches, and even airplanes, as well as commercial galleries and private homes. To take this wider view does not necessarily imply that we are leaving the domain of art to consider a broader category of visual culture. Rather, it is to see modern art as itself constituting a visual culture, an extended network of objects and exhibition venues that had diverse values and meanings for a range of historical actors. While this book explores how modern artists in the post-war period made tapestries to market their art, it argues that such marketing was not simply a quest to make money. Marketing cannot be reduced to the practice of buying and selling, but includes those of discussing, defending, promoting, and exhibiting. Harrison and Cynthia White famously articulated the intertwined relationship of selling and criticism in their conception of the 19th century French art market as a vendor-critic system. Yet examining tapestry reveals an even wider network of artists, collectors, curators, and fabricators who all helped determine what modern art actually was. Using this broader networked understanding of the market to help define what constituted modern art allows us to account for both the material inclusion and the conceptual contributions of tapestry, to examine its discourses as well as its sales. It enables us to define modernism not through a priori concepts that would exclude tapestry as too decorative, reproductive, or French, or as too commercial, but through the actual objects, including tapestries, that were made, exhibited, discussed, and bought as modern art. Modern art and tapestry both reached unprecedented critical, economic, and institutional success during the same historical moment, the 25 years following World War II. And the coincident rise of tapestry and modernism is a mark of the dialogical relationship between them. This dialogue between modernist painting and tapestry occurred on a formal level through similarities in style, on a conceptual level through similarities in how they were described and understood, and on a structural level through similarities in how they were commissioned, circulated, marketed, and collected. This book examines tapestry to illuminate how modernists justified and disseminated their art, and how they created a marketplace modernism through reproduction, display, and criticism. So to go through the chapters a bit more, the first chapter is called Tapestry as Model, and it begins really at the center of post-war American modernism by considering the criticism of Clement Greenberg and the oeuvres of some of his favorite artists, so including Helen Frankenthaler, whose sister, Gloria Ross, produced tapestries. Here you can see a painting of Frankenthaler's on the left and the tapestry version on the right. And the signature in the bottom right corner, HG, presumably for Helen Gloria, so nice sisterly signature there. So I talked about Helen Frankenthaler. This is another one of her larger tapestries woven in France. These are probably my favorite tapestries in the book by Paul Jenkins. These are modeled after watercolors. This one, I apologize, some of the slides are a little fuzzy. As well as Hans Hofmann. He's another example of an artist whose tapestries were made posthumously by his estate. So these are, again, kind of rugs that were kind of marketed as tapestries. Also Kenneth Noland, and I'm particularly interested in how Noland's works, seem to be kind of formally influenced by tapestries. This is a tapestry after one of his plaid paintings, which are arguably already, working in textiles. I mean, not arguably, obviously they are. This is an example of a later painting that seems influenced by tapestry maquettes that he was making around this time for Navajo weavers. He did a whole series of Navajo tapestries with Gloria Ross. Robert Motherwell I discussed in this chapter, who is interesting because he did tapestries, but he didn't seem to like them very much. I guess maybe we can see why, looking at the finished results. And Frank Stella also had a kind of, he did tapestries, but he preferred to do them as kind of one-off commissions for important clients like PepsiCo in this case. Not so much as editioned, kind of multiples like a lot of the others did. So this chapter also introduces the two main American producers of modern tapestry, Gloria Ross, who I mentioned was Frankenthaler's sister, and Charles Slackens from Modern Master Tapestries Incorporated. You see another page from their catalog here. This is showing works by Andy Warhol, Ellsworth Kelly, Picasso, Calder, Jim Dine, and Milton Avery, so to give you a sense of the variety of modern, all these people are considered modernists, right, in this context. And this chapter also identifies a strand of formalist criticism in the work of Greenberg and some of his successors, including Michael Fried and Yves Lambois, that employs textile metaphors to describe the innovations of modernist painting. So I'm really interested in how critics describe painting as a kind of weaving, going on and on about the canvas, the interwovenness, etc. And I examine how the paintings described by these critics relate formally to tapestries designed by the same artists. This chapter argues that tapestry served as a model for thinking through a central problem in late modernist painting, the issue of flatness. As modernist painters worked to fuse figure and ground, painting and its woven canvas support, they were simultaneously creating tapestries in which figure and ground exist on a single continual plane, and in which color and support are one. So understanding the potential of tapestry as a model for modernist painting challenges the Greenbergian doctrine of medium specificity, and shows that modernists may have been drawn to tapestry for formal as well as commercial reasons. And the next chapter, Revival, examines the political reasons why Americans would have been so supportive of tapestry, which French government officials, artists, and dealers were heavily promoting as a quintessentially French art form. And the leader of this French tapestry revival is undisputably Jean Mrsa, whose work you see here. He really championed this revival of tapestry as a medium for modern art, and as a quintessentially French art form. So this is a work that he did during the war that is celebrating the French resistance. You can see the French cock, the rooster, and symbolism, and there's a poem woven into the tapestry by Paul Edouard and so on. So these discourses of revival promoted modern French tapestry as the renaissance of medieval tapestry. Basically these artists, Mrsa and his followers, were arguing that throughout the 19th century, early 20th century, tapestry had gotten away from its medieval roots, and now as modernists they were restoring tapestry to its great medieval tradition. So this is a kind of yet another example of how modernists in the 20th century are treating medieval art as a precedent for abstraction. And this also led to some, kind of new interpretations or new installations of medieval tapestries in the post-war period, including of the Porte of Angers tapestry, which if any of you have seen this, it's really incredible. It's in Angers, France. I highly recommend that you go see it. It's probably the earliest surviving medieval tapestry in France, if you don't count the Bayeux tapestry, which, as many of you know, is not really a tapestry. So there's a lot of kind of renewed interest in medieval tapestry in this period as a kind of precursor to modern tapestry. Modern tapestry was also promoted as a symbol of France's victory over Nazi Germany. And one of the interesting things about the war is that the Nazis are, of course, appropriating, looting all kinds of art, including tapestries. They're also making new tapestries with Nazi imagery in both Germany and in France. And so during the war, both state workshops and private workshops in France were making, not that many, probably a dozen altogether or so, tapestries for Nazi officials. Some people lost their jobs as a result of this collaboration. And so this is just an example of one of these Nazi tapestries woven in France, still in the collection of the Louvre because, they can't get rid of it, I guess. Strangely enough, it's not on display. So this is one of the reasons why the French are so adamant that tapestry is a French art, right, after the war, because they're trying to kind of excise this this German notion that tapestry could be a quintessentially German art. So despite this nationalist context of the French tapestry revival, I do question the kind of conflation of revival with nostalgia. And I argue that the logic of revival is as invested in novelty as in historical continuity. So, a revival narrative is one of rise and then fall and then renaissance, right? There's always a fall, there's always a period of decline. And that's really why the revival narrative is so powerful in the post-war period, because it allows you to treat the war and this kind of thing, but also the whole kind of 19th century period of tapestry being too imitative of painting as this period of decline, right, and allows you to kind of promote what you're doing now as the revival. This chapter also builds on recent scholarly work that reconsiders the post-war Franco-American relationship and draws our attention to France's agency in promoting its cultural importance to American audiences. In contrast to the established narrative that the capital of modern art shifted from Paris to New York, I show how curators, dealers, and collectors in both France and the United States supported the rise of tapestry and other forms of contemporary French art in order to reestablish France's cultural leadership and further Cold War competition against the communist bloc. So just to show you some of the other images, this is just another example of a kind of medievalizing French revival tapestry by Dom Robert, who was an artist who became a monk, so he was particularly invested in this kind of millefleur designs and so on. The group of tapestry artists that Mrsa led were called the peintres cartonniers, the painter cartoonists. And so their kind of claim to fame was that they didn't just create a painting as a model for the tapestry makers, they also made their own cartoons. And Mrsa in particular was known for his carton numérité, his numbered cartoons, so you can see an example of that on the left. It's basically a paint by numbers diagram for the weavers, a weave by numbers diagram. And then the tapestry made from that cartoon shown on the right, and of course the tapestry kind of flips the composition of the cartoon because in France tapestry weavers weave from the back of the tapestry, so they're kind of create a reverse image of the cartoon. And then I also talk a lot about this chapter about images of weaving in the post-war period and how they help construct this revival narrative. And this is an image actually that I found while I was here this summer, so I want to thank Anna if she's in the room for ILLing this book for me. This is an example of how in the 20s, when French tapestry weavers or workshops were kind of marketing themselves to an American audience, they wanted to present themselves as modern, right? So they would describe their workshops as a factory or a plant, and they would have these images of how clean and orderly and and this might not seem particularly modern to us, but it's trying to, make this tapestry workshop seem as kind of modern and industrial as possible. Whereas after the war, the emphasis is much more on the kind of medieval quality of Aubusson, the winding streets, the misty smoke, the stone bridge, the weavers toiling in garrets at night in their clogs and berets. The close-up of the hands, this is very common. These are photographs I should note by Robert Doisneau, who's a very well-known French photographer of the period. So these are, kind of a cut above your average photographs, but they really kind of help set the stage or set the kind of tone for how weaving is depicted in this period. So there's, there's not much emphasis on kind of actually portraying the weaver, right? You kind of fracture the weaver, you zero in on specific parts of the body, you know, what I'm interested in is how these images, ostensibly they're designed to kind of show you how the tapestry is made, but of course they're not really instructional. They are really kind of helping to exoticize weaving and to romanticize it and to kind of make you feel like, you know, this is happening kind of out of time, right? That these people are sort of embodying the medieval past. This is also a more kind of dramatic image of, you know, the weaver trapped behind the work, right? So showing that she works from behind the tapestry. Again, this kind of fracturing of the weaver, you know, not really kind of showing her as kind of dwarfed by the monumentality of the tapestry. This is another common practice, mixing contemporary photographs of weaving with illustrations from Diderot's Encyclopédie of the 18th century. So, you know, suggesting nothing has changed, right? These 18th century illustrations are just as accurate a representation of weaving as photographs today. And I compare these with images of Indian weavers who made the monumental tapestries for Chandigarh that were designed by Le Corbusier. These are images that circulated in the West, where again you can see the weavers are really tiny in comparison to the monumental tapestry or the loom on which it's made. They're kind of in these shabby conditions with boarded up windows and corrugated metal roofs and so on. They're wearing, you know, exotic clothing. So, you know, again, these images are not being shown to explain to a Western public, you know, an Indian weaving tradition or to, you know, kind of show how the works are made exactly. They're really being shown to kind of dramatize how big these tapestries are and kind of how great they are in comparison to the sort of shabby conditions in which they were produced. This is just to show you the finished tapestries in situ. Yes, okay. And then I contrast them also with the images of the Bauhaus weavers, which do focus more on the modernity of the weavers. Here kind of, you know, showing the bobbed hair, the short skirts, some of them wear trousers even, my God. Or they focus on the kind of modernity of the space itself, you know, treating the workshop as more of, again, this kind of factory-like setting. I like this one of Annie Berger, who sort of looks like she's, you know, on top of a skyscraper, performing kind of industrial work. Or not showing the weaver at all, right, and kind of treating the loom like a sort of automatic machine. Okay, so that's all in chapter 2. Chapter 3 is called Reproduction, and it explores the transatlantic tapestry market more fully by exploring tapestry's role as a reproductive medium. It focuses on how tapestries reproducing canonical modern masters such as Picasso, Matisse, and Mrsa fared in the United States, and how the expectations of collectors such as Nelson Rockefeller or curators such as Alfred Barr often clashed with the conventions of the French tapestry tradition. Reproductive tapestry facilitated the proliferation of works by established modernists and thus contributed to the expanding post-war market for modern art. Yet the artists, viewers, curators, and collectors who collaborated with one another to create these works also had to reconcile the practice with notions of originality and authorship that often differed among participants and across national lines. As these actors negotiated market realities and tapestry-specific mode of production, they creatively reconsidered their definitions of originality and authorship in ways more reminiscent of conceptual and postmodern art than the stereotypical view of high modernism. And so I start this chapter comparing this work, which is a tapestry that, after a cartoon or a model that Picasso designed to be executed in tapestry. I've actually forgotten the exact year of when he made the model, I think 39-ish, or it was soon after he did Guernica, and there are some similar formal similarities between this work and Guernica. And Guernica itself was also turned into a tapestry in the 50s. This is woven by Jacqueline de la Durbach, who's a kind of independent French weaver working in the south of France, and she wove a number of Picasso tapestries for Nelson Rockefeller. And so, what I say to open this chapter, right, is that most art historians would see a huge difference between a work like this, which is reproducing an extant painting, a painting that Picasso did not originally intend to be a tapestry design, versus work like this, which is done after a kind of painting collage that Picasso did intend to have turned into a tapestry. But for tapestry makers themselves, there really isn't that big of a difference, right? Or there is no difference. You know, tapestry has kind of always reproduced paintings or other tapestries, and they, you know, they don't see this one as more authentic, right, than this one, or as better, you know, in any way. So this is still an idea that I get a lot of pushback from from art historians. They're like, but there's clearly a difference. I'm like, no, there's really not. You know, but in the realm of kind of reception, right, the kind of expectations of American collectors and curators, you know, those are the kind of tensions that I'm exploring in this chapter. So this is another one made by de la Baume not exactly for Rockefeller, but Rockefeller bought it, obviously after Demoiselle d'Avignon. This is a painting that, or this is a tapestry, I should say, that Alfred Barr hated. He thought it was a terrible reproduction of the painting. Whereas Picasso seemed to have quite liked it. He had it in his own house in La Californie in the south of France. So, you know, people had different expectations of how, to what extent you should really evaluate tapestry according to how well it reproduces the painting. This is another comparison, the tapestry on top, the painting on the bottom. I think this is a nice instance where the tapestry actually seems more interesting than the painting, maybe. This was a work where Alfred Barr and Nelson Rockefeller's curator, Carol Oud, were really worried about making this a tapestry because they felt like, you know, there was just no way to capture all the subtleties of the painting. And so they sent the weaver like very detailed instructions, lots of diagrams correcting the color transparencies, the color photographs of the painting. And this is just one of like many, many diagrams. So, you know, trying to kind of give the weaver all this information so that she could create as accurate a reproduction as possible. Obviously, though, of course, there are differences between them. And in the end, this was one of Nelson Rockefeller's favorite paintings, or favorite tapestries, and he really didn't care, you know, to what extent it looked like the painting. What he cared about was to what extent it could be understood as a work by Picasso, right? So as long as it was, you know, presented as Picasso's work, you know, he didn't really care how much it looked like the original painting. This is an example of this dual signature, Picasso and the Atelier Cavalier, which is the name of the de la Baume workshop. This is very common to have this dual signature in tapestry. So I talk about this kind of idea of there being two authors and how weavers use this model of translation, right? So they are the translator, they're the kind of second author who translates the original author's language into a new language. This is, Matisse is an example of kind of trying to, you know, adapt tapestry production to the American market. On the left are the original cartoons that he made using his paper cutout technique. And on the right are tapestries with new paper cutouts on top of them. This pointer doesn't really work. You can see up here, this is paper laid over the tapestry, or here. And he's doing that, or here, he's doing that to subtly alter the composition so that he can have a new version woven that can be sold in the US without being considered a copy. So at this point in the late 40s, it was still unclear whether tapestries, which are usually woven in editions, right, because it's very expensive to develop the cartoon and, you know, figure out how to weave the tapestry. Once you figure that out, you want to weave a few copies so that you can, you know, make all that work worth it. So Matisse wanted to sell these in America, and his dealer was like, well, you know, they might be then considered copies, and we might have to pay, you know, import taxes, and it might not be worth it. And he was like, okay, well, I'll just change them slightly then, and then they won't be copies, right? So this changed in the 50s. The U.S. government, you know, acknowledged that limited edition French tapestries are works of art and don't have to pay import duties. But this is a kind of interesting moment where, you know, Matisse is kind of increasingly being seen as like a serial artist, right? And this is just a moment where he's working in series, but in order to satisfy the market, right? He's not doing it because he's just like interested in the series. This is a tapestry or a painting that he had reproduced in the French periodical Verve, and he accompanied each color reproduction with these kind of diagrams listing all the different colors. So these are very similar to those numbered cartoons that Mrsa is using. And in fact, he uses this reproduction as a kind of cartoon or as a model for the tapestry weavers at the Gobelin, along with a black and white reproduction, photographic reproduction. So there's a lot of kind of experimentation going on in this period, trying to use photography as a kind of cartoon for tapestry, and just kind of trying to experiment with different ways of creating cartoons. And basically, these are all efforts to make the tapestry, the finished tapestry, a kind of clear expression of the artist's intention, right? These are kind of efforts that artists are making to kind of make the finished work a more exact kind of representation of what they want. Okay, and then in the fourth chapter is called Decoration, and it considers how tapestry was positioned in relation to easel painting by exploring how both mediums were simultaneously understood as decorative, portable, and vertically displayed works of high art. So both, the kind of easel painting and the tapestry have this quality of being portable and vertical, but also potentially decorative. While post-war abstract expressionists are generally characterized as anti-decorative artists who fought bitterly against any association between their work and decoration, I argue that 19th century associations between abstract and decorative art lingered into the post-war period and informed how artists and critics advocated for the role of modern art as part of the built environment. Critics of the period championed both tapestry and modernist painting for embracing a renewed integration between art and architecture, and often once again treated tapestry as a model for articulating the decorative function that all modern art could enjoy. This chapter considers the role that architects such as Le Corbusier, Gordon Bunshaft, and Philip Johnson played in theorizing, collecting, and commissioning modern tapestries, and it interrogates how the post-war crisis of the easel picture, articulated through Greenberg's criticism and Jackson Pollock's all-over compositions, related to contemporary understandings of tapestry as a decorative yet pictorial form of art. So this chapter kind of starts out, a lot of the artists I look at were working at the end of their careers, right, in the post-war period. So they start their careers in the interwar period. Marie Catoli was one of the first dealers to commission modern artists to make tapestries in the 30s. And she started out doing as a kind of, with this kind of fashion interior decor boutique called Mirbor, and started out having artists do rugs. And then when she kind of shifted to being more of an art dealer, she had a gallery with Jean Boucher, she shifts to tapestries. And in this advertisement you can see tapestry is up on the top with painting and sculpture, and the work that's illustrated is actually a tapestry. And at the bottom she lists handmade rugs and art prints. So tapestry is not like rugs and art prints, right? It's more like painting and sculpture. It has this more kind of elite status. And her shift from rugs to tapestries is kind of indicative of her shift from being a kind of decorator to an art dealer. So this is just to kind of indicate the way that tapestry was really seen as kind of decorative, but also elite, right? At the same time, artists who were doing tapestries in the interwar period as kind of part of interior decor schemes, like Raoul Dufy, these are his dining chairs for Catoli that are using tapestry panels as the upholstery. Then after the war, these artists are doing tapestries as kind of standalone collectible works of art. This is a work that he does during the war. He does also a kind of series of tapestries after the war. So these were, commissioned by his dealer. They were included in museum retrospectives of his work. Again, it's kind of showing that tapestry is, no longer being kind of understood as part of kind of furniture, right? But now being understood as art. Annie Albers is also interesting in this regard. Of course, she was at the Bauhaus, but then after the war starts making these pictorial weavings, as she calls them, right? So weavings that should be understood as works of art, and should be therefore hung on the wall and kind of seen as, looked at like an easel painting. And this is a work where it's called a rug, the Picara rug, but you can see from the photograph in this catalog that it's been hung on the wall to be photographed, right? The fringe at the top kind of folds down. So there's this kind of interest in presenting these works, the way that you would present easel pictures. And this is just installation photographs from Denise Renee. This is Josef Albers, dealer. Again, kind of showing how tapestries were exhibited in these kind of white box spaces, like modernist paintings, maybe the sculpture accompanying them. But they're not being marketed in the post-war period as, part of kind of modern furnishing, right? They're kind of left that context, that interwar context. And so, of course, this is a period when critics like Leo Steinberg are really interested in this kind of problem of what happens when you put something on the wall that doesn't normally go there, like a bed. He actually says in this essay, Other Criteria, that you can put a rug on the wall, but that doesn't mean that it's not a rug, right? You still kind of think of it as something horizontal, that is part of this kind of horizontal realm of furnishings. So I think that it's interesting that he's writing this at the same time that these artists are making rugs that are being marketed as tapestries. And then this is just an example from Man Ray. This is a much earlier work, but one that he, there's some debate over when he actually called it tapestry. I don't think he called it tapestry, titled it tapestry until the 60s, but possibly he did that much earlier. But anyway, so this is, again, kind of indicative of the way that, you can take a patchwork, right? But if you put it on the wall and call it a tapestry, suddenly it's a work of art, right? So this kind of association of verticality and tapestry with the kind of status of the easel picture is what I'm kind of investigating here. Steinberg was influenced in part by looking at Monet's water lily paintings, one of which had recently been acquired by MoMA. So, of course, the installation at the Orangerie is the kind of famous state commission, right, that Claude Monet finally got at the end of his career. But earlier he had actually been asked to do rugs by the manufacturer La Savonnerie. He kind of said he would and never did, and then finally they were like, well, let's just use your water lily paintings. And he's like, okay. So they came and, took some as models and made these rug versions of them. But then interestingly, these two are hung on the wall, right? So they're installed kind of like upholstered panels in this very integrated decorative surround. And so I argue that this, this anticipates some aspects of the Orangerie exhibition, right? It's kind of creating a kind of immersive environment, and also, putting that horizontal surface right up on the vertical wall. So the horizontal surface of the lily pond kind of being hung up on the wall. Okay, the Air France also commissions a lot of tapestries for its airplane interiors. And here again, we see this kind of ambiguity in their marketing materials. They kind of present this as a way to turn the airplane into an art gallery, right? So the tapestry is supposed to be understood as a kind of standalone object. But at the same time, pictures kind of show it kind of upholstered panel on the wall, covered up partly by chairs. So a little unclear, right, whether this is meant to be a kind of an easel picture or meant to be a kind of decorative surround that you don't pay that much attention to. Sheila Hicks also did commissions for 747s for Air France, and these seem very clearly to have been kind of background material. It's not to say that tapestry was always understood as like a standalone work of art easel picture, right? It was clearly both. It had both a kind of decorative, integrative function, integrated with the architecture, but could also be kind of have the same status as a painting. And that's exactly why tapestry was really interesting to people in this period. They wanted abstract expressionism to be something that could be part of architecture. This is a work by Gottlieb that was part of a kind of series of exhibitions about murals for modern architecture or works for modern architecture, where basically abstract expressionists are going after architects as a potential market for their work, right? Critics were really excited by this. They were like, oh good, abstract art can be decorative, right? Like it can have a function in modern life. And also these buildings were considered so kind of cold and austere, and so to fill them with modern art, especially tapestry, which is considered so warm and supple and so on, was considered kind of a win-win. Modern architects indeed were one of the main clients for tapestry. They collected them themselves. This is Gordon Buncheff's Picasso tapestry in his library. He also had a Le Corbusier tapestry, and of course, Le Corbusier is also an architect. They also commissioned them for their clients. This is Jan Noor's tapestry that Buncheff commissions. And architects were kind of like dealers. They got, they could buy tapestries at cost, or at the dealer discount. So they were kind of being encouraged to buy and resell tapestries. They also, really presented their buildings as blank canvases for art, right? So this is a photograph of a model where you can see the kind of hypothetical works of art in the model, this kind of giant mural and this sculpture over here. And I think that's something that we tend to forget, right? That the architecture and the art were really seen as symbiotic and really meant to go together. We tend to kind of study them as if they were separate, but in fact they were not. And then this is where kind of Pollock comes in. Again, Pollock participated in one of these exhibitions of kind of murals for modern architecture. And in that exhibition, Peter Blake had this model for his ideal museum using miniature Pollock paintings, again, in the model. And the paintings are hung perpendicular to mirrors so that they seem to extend indefinitely, and also hung presumably without structures, so hung kind of as loose kind of textile walls. So this is, the idea of kind of turning the work of art into the wall, right? Not having it kind of adorn the wall or, hang on top of the wall, but actually become the wall. And this, as I argue, is exactly how you hang tapestries, right? You hang them floor to ceiling, they are loose, separate from the wall, and this creates this kind of blanketed feeling, right? This very kind of immersive surrounding experience. And so here again, I'm arguing that, tapestry really is able to be both decorative in the sense that it's integrated with the architectural environment, but also autonomous in the sense that it is ultimately portable and separate from the wall, right? Unlike a mural. So that really makes it an exciting or attractive model for artists like Pollock. This, of course, is usually considered like the bad dream of modernism, right? The crisis of the easel picture, that the painting would become too much like wallpaper, too decorative, too much like the dress that the woman's wearing, right? But I argue that no, this is exactly the point, that it should be understood as dressing, right, for the architectural space. So it's part of the space, but it's also separate from that space. Okay, so in the conclusion, I talk about feminism. Okay. So because tapestry was a decorative art, one might easily presume that it was feminized and thus marginalized within the discourses of modernism. However, the notion that post-war modernism imposed such a uniform hierarchy between masculine art and feminine decoration is challenged by the period's embrace of tapestry, which had both masculine and decorative associations. I turn to the gender politics of tapestry more explicitly in the conclusion, which argues that the assumption that tapestry was akin to other textiles as a feminized, marginalized practice is largely a product of the feminist art movement of the 1970s, which appropriated textiles as women's art despite the prominence of male artists working with tapestry at the time. These acts of revision helped write modern tapestry out of the historical record, and they continue to inform revisionist histories that place greater value on the postmodern fiber art of the 1960s and 70s than the modern pictorial tapestries of the same decades. Thus, as this book works to write tapestry back into the history of modernism, it also examines the progressive sexual politics that strategically disavowed modern tapestry in order to both construct and contest modernist hegemony. So this is a kind of it's been a difficult conclusion to write, right? Because I'm obviously very sympathetic with the feminist project, but at the same time, it really was not in feminist best interest to kind of admit that modernism had included decorative things like tapestry, right? Their agenda was really to kind of point to the exclusions of modernism, and to then kind of appropriate women artists doing fiber for feminism. This is a more kind of recent example of that. Avakanovich in the WAC exhibition, even though Avakanovich, a fiber artist, was not, never identified as a feminist. At the same time, there are, artists who were very kind of aware of the sexual politics of being marginalized for doing feminine craft, who still are doing tapestries, like Annie Albers. She allegedly gives up weaving at the end of her career and focuses on art prints because she's sick of being marginalized as a craft person, and she figures, if you do prints, then you're considered an artist. But she still is designing tapestries that are woven by other people, like these for the AT&T building, designed by Philip Johnson. So I think this shows that it's not tapestry per se, right, or it's not the medium per se. It's more the mode of production. And as long as she can be kind of understood as an artist who does not weave her own works, she's happy to do tapestry, right? As long as she's not, it doesn't kind of risk her being understood as a craftsperson. And then this is an example of Judy Chicago for her dinner party project. She actually does have tapestries there. They're kind of banners that are like the entrance to the work. And these, again, were woven not by herself or by her own kind of volunteers in her own studio, but by the separate workshop in San Francisco that was kind of modeled on French tapestry workshops. And so, I think, again, this is kind of indicative of how feminists were kind of trying to lump tapestry in with the other more marginalized practices like China painting and embroidery that were feminized and were marginalized. But, they're actually kind of appropriating something that was actually quite visible at the time as a kind of relatively prestigious masculine activity. And then, thinking about someone like Shapiro and pattern and decoration, the kind of avant-garde radicality of her work is really predicated on the idea that post-war modernism excluded decoration, right? That is what kind of gives the political thrust to this work. And so, again, it kind of shows that, it's not really in the best interest of feminists to kind of point to all the nuances of modernism, right? If you're trying to, create a political agenda, you don't necessarily want to, paint your enemy as, a complicated, nuanced enemy, right? You want to kind of simplify it. So I think that is one of the reasons why tapestry kind of got left out of modernism, right? Because it just kind of complicates this feminist narrative from the 70s. Other reasons are primarily kind of economic. Ultimately, tapestry couldn't really compete with art prints, which were kind of taking off at the same time. So yeah, that's how it concludes. Thank you very much. I'm sorry I talked for so long. I'm happy to answer questions. Or return to anything that I skipped over. Yes.
Do you define the period you're discussing as having ended and that we're in a new period?
Yes. Yeah, I think of this postwar modernism as, being kind of overturned by postmodernists in the 70s. So I do follow several artists into the kind of early 80s, and artists like Kenneth Noland, or Robert Motherwell, who it's really not until the early 80s where they start to kind of say, okay, I'm not doing tapestry anymore, enough already. Or like Annie Albers for her works within the 80s. But yeah, most people kind of think of this movement of modernism as really ending more in the 60s. So I'm kind of following, the end of all these artists' careers, which is sort of, again, not necessarily something I would recommend to students in the room. It is kind of more difficult to do.
Thank you very much. That was really fascinating. I just wondered on the issue of original work of art versus reproduction. Mm-hmm. You presented the Picassos and Matisses and so forth's work in tapestry as primarily reproductive. Mm-hmm. And I just wondered whether the artists themselves saw qualities, expressive qualities, manipulated the medium of tapestry to do something different than they would in painting. Is that something?
You mean by the artists, the weavers, or the
designers? They would manipulate the weaving, or they would give instructions possibly to the weavers, such as to produce effects that maybe are not possible in painting. Is that an aspect that you?
Yeah.
And do the critics also address that kind of problem of expression?
Yeah, the critics, I would say not really, but I think the artists definitely did, and that was, you know, something that artists kind of, you know, are interested in, you know, more or less depend just, you know, some artists were more interested in that than others.
So it wasn't just a commercial.
Yeah, yeah, no, so like Kenneth Nolan, for example, with the Navajo tapestries, again, you know, they're called tapestries. Even though, right, we normally think of Navajo as being rugs, but whatever. So the, you know, he was really interested, he really liked the fact that each tapestry was made by one person, that the weaver could kind of, you know, modify his design to suit sort of her own tradition or her own way of working. So he's, you know, in the letters, he often kind of says like, oh, okay, yeah, you don't have that color, that's fine. Or you don't use that color usually, that's okay. Use whatever color you want, right? So he is, you know, a good example of someone who's kind of interested in that sense of translation, right? Or that sense of kind of turning it into a different version of his design. Picasso also, I think, is a good example of that. He was friends with Jacqueline de la Banderoque, the weaver, and he never, you know, asked her to make corrections, right, or changes. She would basically produce the tapestry and show it to him, and he would say, yes, you know, yes, you can sell that, that's fine, you know, even though there are clearly differences. So I think, you know, he was, and he also, as you guys know, did all these ceramics, right? So that's this kind of similar dynamic where he's really, I think, interested in kind of helping these craftspeople, you know, have a market for their work, right, by kind of linking their work to his name. But he doesn't necessarily see it as his work, right? It's kind of like, you know, sure, I'll kind of help you by supplying a design, but, you know, it's your own thing, and you could interpret it however you want.
Can I just sort of add to that? I mean, would someone like Mrsa, who is a tapestry designer,
Right.
would he see his agenda as primarily a tapestry person, as pushing art forward, as it were, in ways that the painters weren't? I mean, so in other words, using his medium
Yeah.
really as a force of modern.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and he's, you know, in a way, because he does kind of restrict it. I mean, he was a painter before he, you know, becomes a kind of dedicated tapestry artist during the war. So he, kind of unlike Picasso or Nolan, right, he really wants the weavers to do exactly what he wants, right? And that's kind of one reason why he develops this numbered cartoon and so on. And he's criticized for that. He's seen as kind of draconian by other people in the tapestry industry. But at the same time, yeah, absolutely, he understands his work as modern and as you know, kind of taking the best of medieval tapestry, right? The kind of the flatness, the abstraction, the pure color contrast, and so on. Even the kind of the symbolism, and kind of making all of that work for a modern age, right? So I think he really sees tapestry as kind of the best expression of the kind of modern era of post-war period. Yeah.
Sam?
Just to build a little on what Andrew was saying, I guess that my question then would be, what was the benefit then for these modernists, these earlier ones like Picasso, Matisse, for example? I mean, I find it hard to think that Picasso was doing these tapestries to assist the crafts people to help write their careers necessarily. You know, you said that Mondrian expressly said he did not want tapestries made that his heirs did this against his will. So that's purely a commercial, I would imagine, a reason that the heirs are doing this. So why do it, really? And then, you know, you mentioned someone like Motherwell who didn't like to do it, and then decided to stop. Why? Why would he feel this? What caused that to happen?
Yeah, well, I think that's a hard question, but I think basically modernists in this period, although modernism is becoming so dominant, they don't necessarily see it that way, right? They don't necessarily feel like they won the debate about what art should be, right? So they're still always pushing for more exposure, more visibility for modernism. You know, of course, they didn't necessarily, you know, there was still a lot of critiques of abstraction in the period. There still are today, a lot of critiques of abstraction, right? So I think that, you know, they were never kind of felt like they had done enough or made, I don't want to say made enough money, but had enough visibility or had enough of a market share, you know, you could say. So, Picasso is a particularly kind of like, I mean, he was making art every single day, right? Like just, couldn't stop. Like, I mean, he was just kind of, not someone to, a widely varying quality, right? I mean, he's not really someone who necessarily is worried about, quality over quantity. So I think, that there was, even though we kind of think of these artists as being so successful and so established, they weren't necessarily as kind of confident. And so Tapestry offered, a way to not just kind of expose their work more, to a different audience or more, but also really a way of legitimating their work, right? Because it is prestigious, it is traditional. It's, especially for French artists, it's state-sponsored, right? These are artists who are not necessarily, being collected by the Centre Pompidou or, right? I mean, this was a way for them to kind of enter that official establishment realm. So for Americans, I think, then the prestige is still kind of linked to its Frenchness, and its kind of traditionalism. And also a way, in America, it really is kind of a multiple, right? So I compared a lot with, I don't know where I'm going with this. I compared a lot with art prints. Art prints have a revival exactly in this period, the print renaissance, as it's called. Art printing is also associated with France, particularly through photography. It also has this workshop methodology where the artist kind of goes in and supplies designs and then the craftspeople make the things. And so, a lot of these artists didn't need to do art prints either, right? They're selling enough paintings, they don't need to do art prints. But it's a way of...
But oftentimes the art prints are original compositions, the print is the original work, right? The original idea goes to the print oftentimes. Unless they're like these collector's series and they're sold for high value in galleries. If it looks just like paintings by the same artist, which they had to do, right, in order for the prints to be marketable, then how original is it really? I mean, a lot of the tapestries are technically originals also in that sense, but they're designed to look just like the paintings. I just don't think that artists are necessarily see any of this as a problem. Like their investment is in creating as much art as possible, basically. And people come along and are like, well, here, we can help create more art for you. They'll do it.
Can I answer that
No,
as an
I'm sorry.
artist? Because I haven't heard much comment from
I'm sorry,
artists.
we like to go around and have people speak who haven't spoken before.
Two quick questions. One may be a little provocative. You use the word decorative a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Tapestries are decorative, things have verticality, hang on the wall. What does the word, how are you using that word? What does decorative mean to you in this context? And the second question about your process, what were your starting questions when you started this project? What was it you were looking for, and what was the paths that maybe led you in some other directions to some other people?
So the decorative question is, I'm really treating decorative as the idea of art being integrated with its surroundings, right? So art that is, that is meant to kind of coordinate with other works of art or with other objects in the room or with the architectural space more generally. So, of course, from the 19th century, right, abstraction is linked to that idea of decorative, the idea that, all of the paintings in the room create a kind of unified ensemble, with one another and possibly or hopefully also with the architecture. So that is in contrast to the idea of an easel picture, which is, an autonomous window onto the world, right, or onto another world. The idea is that tapestry is able to be kind of both at the same time, right? It's both kind of part of the ensemble or part of the architecture around it, but it's also autonomous from the wall. It also has this kind of independent portability and so on. In terms of my thought process, I started this project as a seminar paper, actually, ages ago. And really what intrigued me at the beginning was this kind of, how the modernist criticism kind of uses these textile terms to describe painting, right? So how could we understand tapestry as a kind of model for painting, even as all of these painters are, making tapestries that are modeled after paintings, right? So trying to kind of, reverse this sense of a direction of influence, right? That it's not necessarily that tapestries are kind of always imitating paintings. There might be ways in which paintings are also imitating tapestries. So yeah, that was my kind of initial thought. And then, I was certainly kind of interested in how tapestry was something that like so many different artists did, right? But was a kind of relatively minor part of each of these artists' careers. So, and again, I don't necessarily recommend this as a research strategy, right? But it's, so it's been a process where, you kind of go into individual artists' archives, and you try to find like that one file with like the 5 letters about tapestry, right? And you kind of try to piece together what are the commonalities. It's, but it is a kind of interesting way to talk about artists who are well known, but to talk about a part of their career that is not very well known. So in that sense, it seemed like a viable project at the beginning.
And just to ask in parallel to Eleanor's question, Eleanor's first question about the decorative, how, having executed this project, do you think about craft?
Yeah, so that's true. I don't really consider, I think about tapestry as having more to say about a kind of tradition of decoration than necessarily a tradition about craft, in part because, it is, most of the works I write about were not woven by kind of individual artists, having their own workshops. So it's kind of not really part of this kind of studio craft thing that emerges in the post-war period in that sense. Although there's certainly plenty of tapestry artists in the U.S. today who probably do see themselves as part of that. I think one of the issues with recent scholarship on craft is that it can conflate decoration and craft, and I don't think that is necessarily useful, at least in terms of tapestry. Painting can be understood as decorative, but not necessarily tied to the kind of realm of the applied arts or realm of craft. In some cases it might be, right, but not necessarily. Like I don't think we can necessarily say that decoration and craft are the same, or that they operate in the same way in modernism. So one of the things that I think about Greenberg, for example, is that he's often describes modernist paintings as decorative. He often uses decorative as a kind of synonym for abstract. But craft is something that he, I think, is more kind of wary of, right? He doesn't want craft he doesn't want his artists to kind of turn it into craftspeople, because he associates that with kind of repetition and kind of making products for a market. But decorative is something that he, often uses to say, like, well, this painting, can be, is innovative because it is decorative, because it has that abstract, flatness and that kind of non-illusionistic, non-tableau quality. I think it's, important to kind of distinguish those ideas in this period. Yeah. All right. Sorry, I guess I should. You can field questions.
Much of your talk was, I suppose, concerned with areas like the anxiety of reproduction and the aesthetics of tapestry. But it struck me as you were talking about it that the agency doesn't really rest with the artists or even the craftspeople here. It's the dealers. Given the costs of setting up the looms and all the rest of it, which was way beyond most artists. The initiative here rests with neither the artist nor the craftspeople, and the decisions about what's going ahead and how it's done rest primarily with people that you've not really touched on.
Yeah, well, no, I mean, they're, I think I mentioned dealers quite a bit. Yes, definitely, they are, and the French have this term, the editor, or the person, the publisher, in other words, of the tapestries. And that's, you know, usually a dealer, but in the case of like Gloria Ross, it could be somebody who doesn't have her own gallery. She kind of connects with other dealers in order to actually sell the tapestries. But yeah, these are figures who commission the artists, and then, you know, kind of find the workshop to actually execute the works. And so their role is, you know, much like a publisher, kind of liaising between the author and the printers, right? So, or like the art print workshop director, right? Like, so yeah, these people have a lot of agency, definitely. But of course, the artists have to say yes, and so do the weavers. And there are instances where, I mean, there's certainly instances I talk about in the book where artists say, you know, no, thank you, or no longer. But there are also instances where weavers, you know, have refused to do a tapestry. Joseph Albers actually is a good example of that. His tapestries, you know, were basically, go back to that. The weavers considered them too simplistic, right? If your skill is doing this, it's a kind of an insult to be asked to do this. And so the François Tabard was like, he had to write to Denise Renee and say, I can't do it anymore because the weavers won't finish them. So, you know, there's...
I suppose the issue there becomes, if the dealer can sell the Albers, they'll find another weaver.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, yeah, in this case, Renee only worked with this workshop, so she, you know, she wasn't going to do that, but yeah, certainly one could. Yeah, so I think, and that certainly contributes to the kind of establishment nature of tapestry in this period, right? Because it is market-driven. You know, it's only going to be available kind of to artists who already have a market, and you know.
I think we have time for one short question.
Yeah, I'm just wondering about the biennials, the Lausanne biennials, and like to what extent you address them.
Yeah, I do a little bit. So in the, I guess in the revival chapter where I'm talking about the Cold War politics of tapestry. So those of you who don't know, in the 60s, Lausanne in Switzerland started these tapestry biennials. They were initially kind of organized by Mrsa and really kind of promoted French ideas of tapestry as a kind of mural art, but they quickly became kind of vehicles for exhibiting fiber sculptural work. This was very quickly understood as kind of French tradition versus Eastern European innovation, right? So the kind of Western European press was really kind of presenting Polish and other Eastern European fiber art as, you know, avant-garde, but also as, you know, Eastern, right? And as a kind of a threat to the French tapestry tradition. So this is, you know, one of the ways in which tapestry kind of figures into these Cold War politics. So, and then, you know, that is the kind of work, as that I talk about in the conclusion, as having been, you know, received more attention recently, and is really being understood as, partly because of that Cold War context, really being understood as a formal kind of undoing of tapestry, right? It's a way of kind of overturning all the conventions of French tapestry, and you know, kind of shows how, you know, kind of conservative aesthetically modern tapestry was. But I think, you know, it's also important to keep in mind that for the people who were initially, you know, kind of exhibiting fiber art or, you know, trying to kind of bring visibility to it, trying to promote it, they were able to do so in part because of the tapestry revival, right? So, you know, and particularly in the case of the Lausanne Biennial, right, it's because of the French tapestry revival that there is a venue for exhibiting fiber art. You know, like recent scholarship, I think, tends to, you know, kind of think about them as very separate. they're sort of like, sometimes they kind of acknowledge that there was a tapestry revival, they don't really want to talk about it, right? So, and I think for, you know, for people in that moment, you know, they really, it's not like modern tapestry ends and then fiber art begins, they really coincide. And they, I mean, tapestry kind of starts earlier, and fiber art starts, and then they kind of, you know, keep going side by side. And they both kind of end around the same time, really, in the late 70s. So, you know, I think it's, right, so that this idea that one kind of replaces the other has been kind of overemphasized.
I'm sorry for those who still have questions, but this only marks the end of the formal conversation. You're welcome to continue the conversation informally afterwards. I think, and I hope this is a useful route to send off as we go back to Madison and start the year. And I thank all of you for coming this afternoon.